This is the first of 2 religious language revision sessions. I really want you to keep the 2 sessions separate because they deal with slightly different issues. So this religious language revision session is going to deal with the verification principle, which is all about the idea of whether religious language has meaning or not. The falsification principle, which isn't about meaning. Some of the experts talk about it as being about meaning, but it's not. And it's really important that you kind of ignore whenever your textbook says it's about meaning. The falsification principle is about whether religious language should be treated as being almost of the same quality as scientific statements. It's not about meaning. And then finally, language games. And this is about meaning, and this argues that religious language is meaningful, so can be really well used to sort of challenge the verification principle. The verification principle then started with the Vienna Circle, and the Vienna Circle were a group of philosophers and scientists around sort of the 1920s to early and mid-1930s. They used to meet at the University of Vienna, and they were headed by Moritz Schlick, who used to chair the meetings, and they were influenced by many people, John Locke, David Hume, but also the early work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And this is a useful link to know because you can directly link in your essays the verification principle and language games because of this link, which I will talk about later. Now, one of the topics that they were interested in was establishing a criterion of meaning. So trying to work out a criteria of what makes something meaningful. How do we work out what is meaningful? The verification principle coming from is that if we cannot test it, we cannot empirically verify, then it's meaningless. And so what we can see is any statements about God, ethics, art, metaphysics become meaningless and therefore nonsense. Now, a key person in your specification is A.J. Hare. A.J. Hare is hugely influenced by the logical positivist, and he's a British philosopher. And what he does is he takes the ideas of the logical positivist and he brings it to a British audience in his really infamous book Language, Truth and Logic, and it was written in 1936. And I don't tend to say it's important to remember many dates, but this one is useful because of an example we're going to refer to. So if you look at the sort of shapes on the right, there are 4 sort of elements and phrases to remember when you're talking about A.J. Hare. And so first of all, I'm going to talk about what he means by verification in principle and in practice. So how A.J. Hare develops the verification principle is that he says you don't just have to be able to practically verify something, so to go out and be able to test it. You can also verify something in principle. And what that means is you just know under the conditions that your statement might be true, how you might test it. Even if you practically cannot do it at that moment, you know how you would do it. And this is really important because much of science actually, scientists can't always practically verify something. And A.J. Hare was saying, but they're still meaningful because they know how they would test it. So, for example, in 1936, he uses the proposition, there are mountains on the far side of the moon. Now, in 1936, they could not verify that. They weren't able to test that. But he said this is still verifiable because we know in principle how we would test this statement. We would know that we could go into a rocket, we could go up and we could see and verify and test using our senses whether there are mountains on the far side of the moon. So this is a really good example to use and demonstrate what Hare meant by this verification in principle. Now, the other 2 important aspects to talk about A.J. Hare and how he develops the Vienna Circle's verification principle is that he distinguishes between strong and weak verification. So by this we mean that he says the verification principle of the Vienna Circle was strong. It required conclusive verification. That meant that you had almost without a doubt be able to know whether your statement was true or false through sense experience. Now he says, Hare argues that this is impossible. He said that we can never be conclusively sure that our statement is true or false. So, however, what he says is that we should be able to kind of render our statement probable. So he's kind of lowering the weight of sort of evidence and how sure I have to be. It doesn't have to be conclusively verified, it just has to be demonstrated that it's probable. Now, in his second edition, he does actually acknowledge that maybe he wasn't quite right to completely get rid of strong verification. He says that there are some basic observation statements that can be conclusively verified. So that's something that's kind of useful to know, to be able to sort of offer as a challenge that you might present in an essay. But what we have, and this is why it's relevant to religious language, is AJR in Language, Truth and Logic attacks religious language and any metaphysical language and even ethical language as just nonsense. It's just the same as just saying blah or blah blah blah, making some kind of noise. It tells you nothing factually significant, and that's what he means by meaning. By meaning, he says it's not factually significant. It might be emotionally significant to you to say there is a God, or I believe that murder is wrong. It's emotionally significant and emotionally meaningful to you, but it's not actually meaningful. It conveys no factual or literal significance. Now, it's really important before you go on to criticise, and the verification principle is easy to criticise, it's always good in your analysis to acknowledge strengths. So a strength of AJR's verification principle is that it does allow more scientific theories to be meaningful than the original verification principle, because you can verify in principle and you only have to show probable, and that kind of fits more with the scientific idea. But there are a lot of issues with the verification principle. So the biggest criticism of the verification principle is the principle itself is not meaningful because it cannot be verified. It's neither a tautology, it's neither an analytical statement, and it's not empirically verifiable. So what McGee says is people began to realise that this glittering new scalpel was in one operation after another killing the patient, i.e. it kind of killed itself as a theory because it created a criterion of meaning that it itself did not pass. Now, later on, we have some logical positives saying, sorry, there was a third type of statement that's meaningful, and this is a protocol statement, a statement of method. But I would challenge that. They've kind of contradicted themselves. They started off by saying there's only two types of statements that are meaningful, and now to try and avoid an issue, they're now saying that there's actually a third, and I think that that's a problem there. It also makes an assumption that it's only science that can tell us about the world. We might say, well, why does it have to be that if you can empirically verify something, that makes it meaningful? And we might say this is too narrow, and actually can't we learn things from poetry and art and expression of ideas that have factual significance to us, that affect us, that can't be scientifically verified? John Hick also famously argued that actually religious statements can be verified, especially if we take this idea that we can use in verification in principle. So he gives an example of two people walking along a road to the celestial city, and one person says there is a celestial city at the end of this road standing for heaven, and the other one says, well, I don't think there is. And they say, well, when we get to the end of the road, we'll be able to verify it. I know in principle how I'm going to verify my statement, that at the end of the road I'm either going to see there is this city or there's not. So in the same way, when we die, we will be able to verify our statements, whether there is a God or not, or there is an afterlife. So he says, actually, using as weak verification principle, I can verify my statements in principle. And some people might say that actually there is some sense experience that can verify our statements in principle, or to show that there may be probable. The quantity of religious experiences or the evidence of design in the world. And others have actually argued that the whole verification view of science, that it's about proving itself right and verifying itself, is an outdated view of science. And if we look at Karl Popper, which we're going to talk about next, science is actually concerned with falsification, not verification. And a final criticism that you can use for falsification and verification is one from Vincent Brummer. He says actually it's kind of not appropriate to use these scientific views of statements, so verification and falsification, and apply them to religious statement. He argues that the influence of people like Anthony Flew, A.J. Hare, Richard Dawkins later has meant that people think if something's not like science, if it's not measurable, then it's not worthwhile. And he says, well, actually, that's not self-evident. That's a choice that you are choosing, when we shouldn't see this as this is definitely the way. If it's not scientific, then it's not meaningful, and he questions that assumption. So we move on to the falsification principle. Absolutely key in your essays, you do not say that the falsification principle is a development of the verification principle. It's not. It's an alternative idea, and it's not about meaning. So Karl Popper was the philosopher of science who said that this is what science is. We should be open to falsification. When we put forward a theory, we know how that theory might be proven wrong, and if it is, then we should be open to that. Now, Anthony Flew, he takes the Karl Popper's falsification principle and he applies it to religious language. As I've emphasised before, what Flew is doing is not saying that religious language is meaningless. He's just saying that the quality of the statements is not as good as scientific statements. They appear like people are making assertions about the world like scientists do, but actually they are not as worthwhile, they are not as valuable, because they are not open to falsification. So he famously uses John Wisdom's parable of the gardener, where we have two people come across a clearing. They see that it appears to be well tended, and so one of them, the believer, says, there is someone who tends this place, there is a gardener. And so they run a few tests, and there appears to be no evidence. And so at each point where their original statement that there is a gardener that tends this plot, every time it appears to be falsified, the believer will qualify. Oh yeah, but maybe he's elusive. Yeah, but maybe he's invisible. And so what Flew is saying is this is really similar to religious language. When religious statements are falsified, where there is evidence against them, instead of accepting that falsification, religious people will qualify their statements. And the skeptic in his parable says this kind of poignant question at the end, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, etc., gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? Anthony Flew also uses another example, and I think this is good to use, not just the parable, but also showing that maybe you've read the rest of his paper. And he says, for example, people say, God loves us as a father, so that's the assertion. And then the evidence against it. So you have the earthly father, so the child's biological, parent, is trying to help them. And he says, well, where is the heavenly father? He appears to do nothing. So that appears to be falsified in the original statement, God loves us as a father. Religious people say, well, God's love is different. We cannot fully understand God. And this hopefully reminds you of what you would have studied last year about the problem of evil and the theodicies. And in the end, Flew says that your statement dies the death of 1,000 qualifications, that you have so qualified and so justified in spite of the evidence facing you that God doesn't seem to love you as a father does. Your original statement dies the death of 1,000 qualification. And he ends his article with this question that I've put in bold at the bottom. What would have to occur, or to have occurred, to constitute for you a disproof of the love of or the existence of God? Flew is saying, really, there is nothing. There is nothing that you allow to falsify your statement. Whereas on the other hand, a scientists will be open to falsification. And that's why their statements are more worthwhile, more valuable, more factual, because they are open to falsification. Now, R.M. Hare replies to Flew. And Hare is interesting because he actually says, Flu, you're right. If religious statements were assertions, like scientific assertions, then you've won. But Hare says, actually, religious statements are not assertions, they are blicks. And these are your worldview, the way that you see the world. They are unverifiable and unfalsifiable. They are so important to you, and they almost change the way you see the world, and they kind of influence you to make decisions about the assertions you will believe in, but you can't prove them right or wrong. And he uses the example of someone who believes that all of the university dons or professors are trying to kill him, and no matter how much evidence he is given, he never changes it, and this is because he's his blick. So Hare says Flu's challenge of the falsification principle isn't quite appropriate. It doesn't fit religious language because religious statements are blicks, and therefore they can't be proven false or true. But he does say there are sane and insane blicks, and what matters is having the right blick. But he doesn't give us any idea about how we know if something's insane or sane, because you can't test them. So that is a sort of questionable part of his idea. Now, the third person to involve himself in the discussion is Basil Mitchell. Now, Basil Mitchell disagrees with Hare. He says religious people are making assertions, they are making statements about the world as a scientist would. They're not blicks. And he uses a different parable, and his parable is really different to the John Wisdom's parable, the gardener, that Flu uses. And the difference lies in the meeting of the partisan and the stranger. So hopefully you all know this, but this is when we have someone who's fighting a resistance, and they meet a stranger, and the stranger says to him, I'm on your side, and they have this long conversation. And importantly, they've met, and the partisan believes the stranger. Then the partisan sees him acting against the resistance and arresting his friends, and all the while he says, but I still believe he's on his side. And what Mitchell is saying, that if we look at Flu's parable, they never meet the gardener. They don't really have any reason to believe in the gardener other than just evidence that it seems to be well tended. But for religious people, they have trust and they have faith in the person of God. And so there is some grounding to why they maintain their belief in spite of the evidence. And he says, really, there are three ways that believers can react when their assertions are challenged. They can just discard them, or they can just keep them and they make no difference to their life, or they can engage in it, recognise the fact they're challenged, think about them, a bit like the problem of evil, where you think, well, why would God allow evil? And you try and think about it and come up with your own ideas. And he said this is how religious people engage with arguments for and against, is that they are significant articles of faith. They recognise that they're challenged, but because they have trust and faith in the person of God, and they have reasons to commit and maintain their belief, that they're not going to allow experience to count decisively against them and just discard them easily, because there's a reason why they believe in them. Now, there's some additional criticisms of the falsification principle and Anthony Flew, is that R.B. Braithwaite would actually say you can't really apply the falsification or the verification principle because religious statements are non-cognitive, so you can't treat them like scientific statements which are cognitive. You could also use the Brummer criticism, which is very similar. Now, Richard Swinburne says, and you can use this if you wanted to as well for the verification principle, that even though some statements can't be falsified because of the very nature of them, like the toys come out of the cupboard only when no one's looking, you can't falsify that because of the very nature of it. We can still understand it still has meaning, and we still learn something from it. Now, a final theory is that of language games. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, he had kind of two main strands to his work, his early work and his later work, and the Tractatus represents his main book of his early work. And in his early work, he very much has quite a clinical and analytical view of language, and what some people call the picture theory of language. And he said that statements are meaningful insofar as they picture states of affairs, they represent and stand for empirical facts, so things that you can observe or link to them clearly. Now, therefore, metaphysics and religious language and things like that become nonsense, because they're not empirical facts. You can't picture them in reality, and there's not that clear link. And this is what his early work was, and we can see clearly how this influenced the logical positivist, because this is very similar to the verification principle. Now, Wittgenstein later on in his life actually rejects this early work, and in his collection of works that become known as philosophical investigations, he rejects this picture theory of language. Instead, he says language actually gets its meaning from the context that it's used in. Language, he said, functions like a game. He's not saying it is a game, he's just drawing an analogy. It's like a game. And with a game, unless you understand the rules, you can't play. So you won't understand the meaning of words unless you are playing in the game. And he argues, and I've got this quote at the bottom, that misunderstandings and the problems that philosophers have and other people have is when you use words wrong. It's when you use them in error, and you use them in different regions, so in different games, and you don't understand that the meaning has changed between the games. So he says language is a form of life. It's a social, it's a community activity. And he uses famously the example of chess. Now, you don't become a grandmaster of chess by knowing the rules, knowing how queens can move in any direction, that knights can only do that sort of L shape, that pawns can only move forward, etc. You understand the meaning of the game and really get to become a grandmaster of chess by playing it. So in the same way, we only understand the meaning of language by using it. Now, evaluating language games, positive religious language is meaningful. So you can use it as a way of criticising the verification principle. Also, what it means is that it's not appropriate for atheists to criticise religious language, as they are not in the language game. And so, in a way, it kind of protects religious language. However, religious language becomes non-cognitive, and I would question, would religious believers find this satisfactory? Would they not feel that they are actually making factual cognitive assertions about the world? God made the world, God has a relationship with people, and to say that that just becomes something that is just an opinion, is non-cognitive, I would question whether religious believers would find that satisfactory. And others have said, well, if we're all within our own religious language games, or atheist games, or a Sikh religious language game, etc., then we're not going to get this discussion and this debate, because we can't engage, because we're in different language games.